Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. It's Cynicalex, and today I'm going to make a video on leaderships, which is a long requested video that I often put off doing because it's deceptively complicated despite being very simple up front. Simply put, a leadership is just the leadership ability that the character has when they are put in the leadership slot. So you have 242 characters, which means you have 242 leaderships. Now, we don't have, thankfully, 242 unique leaderships because a lot of them get duplicated and there's a lot of repeating, but there are actually a lot more categories of leaderships than you might think. So this video itself is not even going to cover an exhaustive amount of every single type of leadership because there's literally over a dozen, and some of them are just not worth mentioning. But very, straightforwardly, when I have Arrow in the leadership position here, right in the middle of the team, she's going to be giving everybody 6% all speeds. It applies to all allies. Obviously, that is very weak, not very good. It is attack speed and movement speed, which seems good, but it's just not good. However, if I move Swordmaster over to the middle spot here, he's now giving all hero allies, only the heroes, thankfully Arrow and Wave are heroes, 35% all defense. That's a little bit better, still not good enough to make the list. And then you have a leadership like Waves, which in this case is going to give all allies the same 6% all speed like Arrow, and then to Namor specifically, 60% all attack. This type of leadership actually does make it into the game, but in a category I'm going to call a niche debuff, or a niche buff, excuse me. So let's dive into it here. Again, I'm just off the top of the bat, I'm going to mention that I am not covering, it's not an exhaustive list. For example, Drax is not on this list, despite being one of the best or the best leadership for HP for a character like Immortal Hulk, because this video just doesn't, there's just not enough time to cover every single leadership in the game, and it's just not going to help you to know these kinds of things. If you need very, very, very niche, super niche stuff like that, then you have to look it up on a per character basis. But yeah, I've broken this down into 8 or 9. I didn't even count, but 8 or 9 ranks here. We have God tier leaderships, which I'll explain what that means. 45% plus leaderships, mixed leaderships, PvP mostly leaderships, team-based leaderships, debuff leaderships, niche buff leaderships, and self-lead leaderships. These are the ones that I thought were most important to cover, and this covers over 80 characters. So as you can see, I've already grabbed a third of the characters in the game in a an hour-long or 45-minute long scan that I did of all the characters in the game. This is what my brain sort of highlighted as the most important ones. So we're just going to go through and categorize all these characters so that you can get a feel for the best leaderships in the game, leaderships that you can aim for, leaderships that you should value, and why characters are valued for said leaderships, and so on and so forth. Just keep in mind, I may make a couple mistakes here and there with the exact numbers on these leaderships. I don't have them all fully memorized. So yeah, don't kill me in the comments if that happens, if that's the case. But do feel free to correct if there's a glaring error there. So we'll start off with self leads because it's the easiest one to understand. These are just characters that are selfish, and it's a very good example is Deadpool. So their buff only really applies to themselves, and it will literally say applies to self, which is a really important thing when you're reading the leadership to understand that it does say that, and you have to differentiate that. So another good example of that is Taskmaster, where he does provide support buffs to other characters, but he does not need to be in the leadership position in order to supply those support buffs, right? So that's a really important distinction to make for that. Another example of a self-buffing leadership is someone like Mr. Sinister. So I've given you guys some examples of what a self-buffing leadership is. It's really not that important to know long-term because it applies to very few characters, and it's just not all that, it's not all that bad if you forget. But yeah, this does exist in the game. It's kind of funny, to be honest, and it serves a purpose, right, for multiple reasons. Then we have niche buff leads, and the character that I initially gravitated towards that I thought would be a good example of that was Human Torch. Human Torch gives a 50% fire resistance lead, which will increase your fire resist by 50%. This only really applies to game modes where you're going to take a lot of fire damage like Mephisto World Boss Legend, but it actually does apply really well there. But then I started thinking of some other niche leads, or however you pronounce this, and then I realized that the category can actually be a lot larger if we include some of these very, very, very specific character buff leads. So these are sort of like self buff leads. They'll apply some kind of effect to everyone on the team, like Wave, but a specific buff, a very, very good buff to a specific character. So another example of that would be Spider Carnage, the Miles Morales Carnage variant, who applies a crazy buff to Carnage and doesn't really give much of a buff to the other characters on the team. So these are both really good examples of this. We actually have Drax here, despite the fact that he's not going to. He can be in the niche league. It doesn't really matter. Just, you know, it's just for HP, like tons of HP. Very, very small list of specific characters. And then you have characters like Vision, who apply a small all attack lead to all allies, in this case 20%, but for Scarlet Witch specifically on the team, he will give her an additional 50%, which stacks to 70%. A character like Hulkbuster is similar to Vision and similar to Carnage and Wave in the sense that he gives 70% to Iron Man, 70% all attack, and he gives 35% all attack lead to all allies. But I'm actually going to put him higher on this list because not only does he have the 35% lead, which is way better than anybody else here for all allies, but then he has additional support buffs for all technokinetic allies. Rounding out the list for niche buffs, in my opinion, are characters like Proxima, who have secondary stat buffs. So she doesn't give you an attack buff, but she's going to give you a crit damage buff and an ignore dodge buff, which can be extremely useful, in some cases better than an all attack buff. But that is going to be, you know, on a case-by-case basis. You have to judge that for yourself, also based on your other characters' builds, right? If you like to rock CTPs of Rage or Obelisks that don't have Ignore Dodge, then her leadership becomes better. If you've got a lot of energies, or you're using characters that just have native Ignore Dodge, or they're not villains to take advantage of her passive, then it's not as good. She could be higher or lower on this list because of the passive, but this is not a tier list about passives, it's a tier list about leaderships. And then you have a character like Red Guardian. I hesitated to put him in the PvP mostly category because he's 35% HP, which is 5% higher than basically every other character that has an HP lead. There's a few leads that are, you know, 35% energy attack, 30% energy attack, 30% all attack, 30% physical attack, 30% HP. I decided that these leads are just too common to be listed here, but this one is specific because it's 35%, but it's not enough to be PvP mostly, in my opinion. And I'll explain why when we get to the PvP mostly category. Then we have debuff leads. There's very, very few debuff leads in the game, but they are very important, so they have to be delineated and sort of picked out versus everyone else. So you've got White Fox, you've got Dr. Voodoo, and then you've got Enchantress. The reason why I don't include Enchantress here is because I actually forgot about her icon. She's a paywall character, yada, yada, yada. White Fox's uniform is technically paywall, but yeah. So all you need to know is there's only 3 debuff leads: Enchantress, Dr. Voodoo, and White Fox. So yeah, I'll add Enchantress to this later. It's not a big deal, but basically these are really important because these are going to increase your debuffs by 25 to 40%. The key debuff here being all defense down. All defense down is a huge precursor to Pierce, and it goes hand in hand with something like Ignore Defense, and it allows you to deal insane amounts of damage to bosses, specifically bosses with high defenses and things like World Boss Ultimate, World Boss, not World Boss Legend, but World Boss Ultimate, and it allows you to really punch up on content. So yeah, it's a very small category of characters, but they represent a very important combo in the game that's going to deal a lot of damage. Then you have one of my most favorite types of leaderships, which are team-based leaderships. And these leaderships will only apply to a specific team of characters. So for example, Icarus, his leadership is 60% all attack, but only to Eternals allies. That's a really important factor that you need to consider. Another one is Iron Fist. It's 60% all attack to defenders, only to defenders. Or you've got Kitty Pryde, 65% all attack and I think 6% crit rate, but only to mutants. This one is a little bit more wide ranging, so I could actually put this one in the 45% plus because it's all mutants. It doesn't actually fit necessarily in a team-based approach, but it sort of links to that in a way. You've also got things like Mr. Fantastic / Maker, which would be all Fantastic Four members. And you also have characters like Green Goblin with his newest uniform, Iron Patriot, that's going to give all Dark Avengers allies 60% all attack. You've got characters like Luke Cage, which give all Defenders allies, you know, that PvP value of debuff immunity and physical damage immunity. You have Blue Dragon, which is going to give all Warriors of the Sky the all attack buff and, you know, debuff immunity as well. So you sort of understand that these leaderships are only going to apply to a specific group of characters. Another good example being Spider-Woman. Only Spider Sense allies that have the Spider Sense ability are going to be able to take advantage of her leadership, which is an all attack and debuff immunity when you get debuffed. So yeah, I may be missing one or two here that we'll sort out at the end, but essentially team-based buffs are very, very strong, but also apply to a very small amount of characters. So they have to be, you know, carefully selected and sort of hunted down once you've built up the team associated with them. Because generally speaking, these characters don't perform that well on their own in solo content. There are some exceptions, of course, but generally speaking, they are going to be stronger together, you know, ape strong together type thing. And then you have PvP, mostly leaderships. This specifically talks about, or this specifically mentions debuff leaderships. And I don't want to make too big of a deal about debuff leaderships, but debuff leaderships are very important because they're going to offer you protection against debuffs. And there's actually so many debuffs in Marvel Future Fight: Stun, Bind, Snare. You know, there's so many. I named 3 and there's like 15 more. So it's essentially the meta in PvP, and it has been for the past like 5 years since they introduced the debuff lead, or 4 years, that debuff leaderships are really important. Now, I don't have an exhaustive list of all debuff leaderships, but I am going to include some really important ones like Molecule Man's, which has some additional benefits to it. It's got like chain hit damage reduction, and it does ignores team faction buffs and debuffs. You'll have to investigate why Molecule Man's leadership is much better than a lot of these other debuff leaderships, but I just want to highlight how many debuff leaderships there are in the game by mentioning characters that you may have forgotten about, like Nimrod, Thane, and Supergiant. So there's actually a ton of debuff leads in the game. Because of the number of debuff leads, you want to choose characters that are not only going to give you that lead, not specifically lots of characters, but one, but who are also going to be very strong. So while, you know, Thane and Supergiant have debuff lead, obviously Sentry and Doctor Doom are much more attractive leads for this because they're also insanely powerful PvP characters. So it sort of double dips. But again, as a leadership, it's just a sort of a catch-all for that debuff immunity that's going to help you sort of get started and sort of get your footing in PvP. A really good free-to-play option for debuff leads is Angel. I actually don't want this to go over to, I don't want to spill this into 2 brackets. There are 2 lines, so we're just going to take somebody out here at the end. But essentially, we'll leave her, sure. We'll take Thane out. But essentially, yeah. Angel is like the easiest, earliest access to debuff lead, but generally speaking, you're going to want to lean into some of these characters later on for PvP, because you're going to double dip. They're going to be amazing PvP leads, and they're also going to be amazingly strong characters. Then you have what I call mixed leads. And basically what I'm trying to say here is that these leaderships don't necessarily offer you an extremely high number, but they're going to offer you some additional benefits that are in some cases more powerful than just raw percentage numbers. Because sometimes people see 50%, 60% attack lead, and they think that's just the best. But in some cases, having, you know, 36% energy attack and 36% or 30% ignore defense is really good. Or you have Doctor Strange, who gives all allies 30% energy attack and 20% ignore dodge. Then you have someone that I've mentioned before, but like Hulkbuster is 35% all attack. And then for Technokinetic allies, which is a larger group, it's not as big as like mutants, but it's bigger than team-based buffs. He's going to give all Technokinetic allies 30% HP. So he sort of combines, it's sort of like a mixture of 2 leaderships into one, which is really good. Then you have someone like Iron Hammer, who's going to give you some energy attack. He's going to give you some lightning attack, and he's going to give you some skill cooldown. So he's got a really nice sort of smorgasbord, right? He's going to give you a general purpose cooldown buff, which is great for all characters, especially early in the game, early in your account when you have low cooldown on your cards. But then if you put him with an energy attack character, they get even more of a buff. And then if you put them with an energy attack lightning character like Thor or Beta Ray Bill, then they get the maximum amount of buff from Iron Hammer. So Iron Hammer for that reason is actually often recommended as the best early game leadership, and that's why, because you basically combine some of the best you combine the best early game lead with some other leads that are just solid in terms of adding additional offensive value. You have someone like Bishop, who's going to give you energy attack and energy defense, which can be good for like a PvP build. It's a bit more niche, but it's still good. You have a mixed lead like Wasp, which is going to give you all attack, all defense, all speed, and the debuff immunity. That's technically a support buff, but it still means that her leadership has a mixed value, which, you know, isn't going to be classified well in any of these other categories. You have someone like Apocalypse. I believe her lead is actually 23%. But anyways, you've got Apocalypse, which is similar to Wasp. It's like all attack, all defense, and all speed. You've got another mixed lead. Some of these are a little bit tougher to quantify, but you've got a mixed lead like this one, where you've got crit damage or crit rate and ignore dodge. In general, the ignore dodge leads are going to be a bit more niche in general. So you've got Gambit, you've got Cable. These are 50% ignore dodge leads. So you could put Domino here. Ignore dodge leads have some P value, but most of it is in PvE. You've got a leadership like his, which is energy attack plus the support buffs. So you can see why these sort of mixed leaderships do add some additional value, but it's value that you're going to have to figure out on like a per character basis. And then you have the 45 plus. So for these ones, it's just very, very high numbers, but it's going to honestly and often have additional passives included. So for Beast, all combat types are going to get 50% attack or physical attack and 10% crit damage. It's going to be a little bit more, you know, restrictive in the sense that you have to be careful. Physical attack, energy attack, combat type, other types. But if you hit the right type, then you're going to get a massive buff. Gladiator is going to give all allies 55% all attacks, which is very straightforward. Just a very, very good leadership buff. You've got a character like Crescent who's going to give all combat types 60% all attack. Very, very high buff in terms of the numbers, but it's also going to be very, very restrictive. You've got Star-Lord giving all blast types 55% increased energy attack. Abomination, like Crescent, is going to give combat types, I believe, 60% all attack. Hyperion is just a 45% lead, so it's 45 and up. Hela is a 45% lead who has a passive buff with her new uniform. Satana is a 60% elemental lead, or 70% fire for fire damage specifically. Same thing with Red Hulk with his newest uniform. It's a 60 or 65 or 70, I can't remember exactly, but it's a very, very high number of fire damage for those types of characters. Misty Knight gives characters 60%, all allies 60% increased cold damage. Now, one thing I want to say specifically about these leaderships is that they only apply, or they're only going to take effect if the character has the elemental damage in question. So this is actually something that can be confusing, but basically, if you look at Misty Knight's lead, all allies increases their cold damage by 60%. That's not going to give you cold damage. It doesn't confer cold damage upon characters that don't have it. So the character has to have cold damage. So you see Cold Shoulder deals cold damage specifically. Spark Burst does not. It deals lightning damage. So her leadership actually only applies to 2 of her skills, Freeze Strike and Cold Shoulder. It applies to all 5 of Luna's skills. It applies to all 5 of Iceman's skills. But you have to be very, very careful. This doesn't give you the elemental damage. It only works for characters who already have elemental damage. And that also goes for the CTP of Judgment. It's not going to give you elemental damage. It's only going to apply effectively to characters that have elemental damage. For the God tier, I know you're probably wondering, where are the God tier leaderships in the game? So we've got leaderships like She-Hulk, where this is a different way of calculating the buff because it increases damage. It does more damage to male characters. It's a bit restrictive, but it's going to add a different type of multiplier that just multiplies your damage in a different way. That is just really, really good. I can't explain it in more technical terms than that, but it's just an extremely strong leadership. You have one like Dormammu, which is doing a similar thing. It's going to give you a increased buff to all villain allies will get an increased buff when they're dealing damage to heroes. So this is like a hero killer leadership. Very, very strong for Danger Room when you're fighting against Jean Grey and that week there. This one is a little bit more niche as well, but it is technically a God tier buff under the right circumstances, right? These niche buffs are not God tier buffs under the right circumstances, I guess, for a single character. But if you're going to get more general and you're going to apply to a lot more characters in the game, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50, then you're talking God tier buffs. You also have Ancient Ones buff. This one's a bit tough because it's a 45% blast or blast or energy. No, I think it's just energy attack. It's a 45% energy attack lead, which doesn't necessarily seem that good. No, it is blast types. Okay, so it only applies to blast types, and it's a 45% energy attack lead. So that's technically pretty niche. It should go down here. But here's the thing. Ancient one, with or without the uniform, has some crazy buffs on Ancient Harmony. So these buffs are going to add a bunch of extra effects. And that's really what makes this such a good leadership, because you're combining all of these additional passives that are going to make the totality of the leadership worth so much more, right? So it's sort of like if Taskmaster had a really good all-purpose lead, then he would be a god tier leadership. But because he only has the support lead and his leadership is very selfish, he just doesn't make the cut. So yeah, you've got the 25% elemental damage, so that's really strong for elemental characters, and then you also have 25% ignore dodge. So you basically have a smorgasbord similar to some of these leaderships and some of these leaderships, but on a very, very high tier of damage and sort of offensive buffs. You also have a character like War Machine. War Machine I would probably put in the 45 plus range, but yeah, he's going to give all allies, I believe, 30% physical damage, or physical attack, which is not necessarily meta or not necessarily very high tier, but then all technokinetic allies like Hulkbuster are going to get the all attack, all defense HP. So that is huge, and that's why I'd put him a little bit ahead of Hulkbuster. His leadership is a little bit more muted, but the totality of his buffs, which is basically still a leadership, puts him into this 45 plus category. You have someone like Cyclops, who's going to give 35% all attack to all allies and 25% all defense, but then he's going to give an additional 30% energy attack. So he's technically at 65% energy attack for all allies. You have leaderships. I mean, Ancient Anti-Man is just another 45% all attack lead, straightforward. He's another 50% ignore dodge lead. Magneto is a 45% lead, but only for mutants, so he's a little bit worse than Kitty Pryde. And so if you had to choose between one or the other, and you had both, and the restrictions didn't exclude one of them, then obviously Kitty would be better than Magneto. But again, that's something you need to calculate yourself. This one here, I technically should put him in mixed because it's a 40% lead, but it's also a very rare lead. It's increased mind damage, and that is to date the only character in the game that has a mind damage lead. So yeah, Kid Omega gets a pretty big buff for that. Another god tier buff, another god tier lead is Baron Zemo. Only applies to villains, but it's going to give them 65% all attack and something like 35% ignore dodge. It's crazy buffs. Really, really strong leadership. But again, it's only going to apply to specific characters. You also have Ronin. Now, people might not remember this, but Ronin gives all universal allies 50% all attack, which is crazy. Then like 36% all defense and 20% ignore dodge. It's part of his passive, but those things together just make his leadership absolutely bonkers and very, very powerful for a bunch of different reasons, for a bunch of different, niche contents. You've got someone like Nick Fury, who's going to give all hero allies 50 or 55% all attack, and then he's got that passive buff, which is another like 50% increased damage to villains and super armor. So as a leadership, he's just one of the best in the game for that reason. You can honestly put him somewhere around here, maybe even here, because most good characters at this point in the game are still heroes, so that really does apply. Now we've got a bunch more down here. We don't necessarily have to categorize all of them. Moon Girl, she's just a 36% all attack lead, so that's just solid. It's just that it applies to all allies, and 36% is it's basically the highest tier, or the second highest tier before 45, which is basically the highest tier in general for an all attack buff that applies to all allies. You've got Goliath with a 45% physical attack lead to all allies, which is another really good one. You have Rescue's HP shield, which seems to be good for PvP. So needs more testing, but it's basically one of the only leaderships that's not debuffed that's going to allow you to do PvP. You've got the physical damage immunity lead of someone like Black Dwarf. Luke Cage has it. There's a bunch of other Jessica Jones has it. This is very niche. It's mostly for Alliance Conquest counters. If you see a team that's all physical, you can throw this lead in front, and then your teammates are gonna just be laughing. I think Colossus has that buff as well, and there's a couple of other characters that have that. But yeah, you have a lead like Mephisto, which I would say is kind of like a mixed lead, because I believe it's all villain allies are going to get when they get debuffed, they get debuff immunity, and they get 30% increased fire damage. So I hesitate to call this a mixed buff. It's sort of like a self buff, because as far as villain allies that deal fire damage, there's very few. Like, it's not a long expansive list, so it's almost like a self lead, because obviously it applies to Mephisto himself, but technically it applies to all villain allies. So this one's a little bit trickier, but it's a pretty decent lead. But generally speaking, you're using Mephisto's lead in that case, and you're using him as a main DPS. you have a character like Ghost Panther, who, again, it's sort of like a niche buff, it's sort of like a mixed buff. His regular buff is going to give you 30% fire damage and 15% crit rate, which doesn't seem that outstanding. Just keep in mind that elemental damage accounts for a little bit more than physical energy or all attack damage. So when you're calculating it and you're looking at, 30% energy attack, 30% physical attack, 30% all attack, and then 30% of an element, if your character deals that element, the 30% elemental damage is worth more than just the way that it's calculated. So you basically just count that a little bit higher. So for characters that deal fire damage, his lead is better than a 30% physical or energy attack lead. But on top of that, he's going to give, on his passive, increased damage to villains and 50% fire damage. So his leadership is technically, if you calculate the passive, 80% fire damage. So that's why in a lot of cases, people will use Ghost Panther lead instead of Satana or instead of Red Hulk. And then they can use another passive support like Valkyrie or whatever, which is going to offer more overall buffs than just using Satana or Red Hulk and then using Ghost Panther support. So that's another thing to keep in mind. You've got a 60% lightning lead or lightning damage lead like Beta Ray Bill, which is very good elementally. So that's why it's in the 45% plus tier. And then you have the rest of these here. I'm not exactly sure why we need to talk about all of these, but this is 60% to symbiotes. It's a little bit restrictive. It's actually quite a bit restrictive. It's one of the more restrictive ones because we have so few symbiotes, but it is 60% lead. You've got the pretty interesting lead. I'd call this a mixed lead. It's almost good enough to be a 45% lead for Victorious. It is, I believe, 30 or 35% all attack to all allies, in addition to 30% HP on her passive buff. And then for Dr. Doom specifically, she's going to give him another 40% attack and some damage reduction. So it's sort of a mixture of a niche buff lead and a mixed buff PvP lead. It's pretty interesting. I like her leadership a lot. It's quite creative. But yeah, you've got Ebony, who honestly has another really amazing lead as long as you're fighting, and you can apply the passive buff because it's a 40% energy attack lead to all allies, which is almost high enough to be above this one. But then he's also going to give allies those increased damages to universal types. So it's tricky. I'd actually probably put it here because it's technically not even 45%. It's honestly actually mixed. I wouldn't put it God tier. I made a mistake. But yeah, you got to make sure that you're fighting the right enemies. You've got a fire damage lead like Red She-Hulk with HP and damage reduction on her passive, so it actually makes her even better. The best fire damage leadership besides the more offensive ones like Ghost Panther. You have technokinetic allies get 50% increased attack and then also a passive for another 20%. I believe energy attack to all allies. So Ghost can sort of be God tier if you're dealing with technokinetics, but otherwise she would be here. Again, it really depends. Obviously, Ghost, someone like War Machine or even Hulkbuster could be in the 70 plus category if you're using, or 100 plus if you're using Iron Man or these types of characters. You have just a generic 45% increase energy attack lead in Scarlet Witch's case. You've got the 45% lead to, or 48% lead to all universals, plus an extra passive buff for Inhumans. So can be God tier if you're dealing with Inhumans specifically, but otherwise I would just put her in the 45% tier. And then actually we just don't need to talk about it. I mean, yeah, so actually America Chavez's lead is pretty bad. I forgot. It's just 30% all attack and 6% dodge. So it's not really worth mentioning. And then Captain Marvel has just a generic 30% lead, which again is not really worth mentioning because it's so easy to find. So yeah, I think this is a pretty comprehensive list of all of the best leaderships in the game, and also highlights the complexity of leaderships in this game because it really is something you need to consider, not only for your team composition, but then who you're fighting. Whether you're fighting characters in PvP or PvE, whether you're fighting heroes, villains, whether you're fighting male characters or female characters, and then whether your team is composed of male or female characters, team-based characters, characters that rely on debuffs, characters that rely on elemental damage, or characters that have a specific typing, whether it's universal, combat speed, blast, or deal energy or physical damage. So considering all of that, choose the right leadership. It's that simple, but it's actually extremely complicated. So yeah, hit me up in the comments down below. Let me know what you think of my tier list. There may be a few changes that need to be done, but I did this on the fly. So yeah, I think it's pretty good. Thanks so much for watching. Smash the like button if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.